everybody, it's nice to meet you. I am Becky Brown. I am one of the 3 primary maths product owners at Twinkl. So a little bit of background for me. I was a primary school teacher for 19 years, and during that time I also led Key Stage 2 and maths. I also have got experience of tutoring up to Key Stage 3 and 4 as well. So although my experience is mainly primary based, and the things I'll be sharing today are mainly primary based, everything is also applicable to secondary learning as well. When Helen reached out to the maths team and asked for someone to do a session, I jumped at the chance because I do have some experience of teaching EAL learners. In one of my settings, I had it was a very small one form-entry school in our town centre, and I had 50% children who had English as an additional language. So I do have some experience and a vast range of types of experience as well. We had children who were pretty much bilingual at home, and some children who were very new to the country, and so new to the language as well. So some experience there, and I've aimed to use that experience and some research to put together this session today. And there will be time, as Emily said, at the end if you've got any questions, and if you've got anything as we go through, you can of course drop that into the chat, and then I can address anything, or Helen at the end. So quick overview of what we're going to look at today. I think it's probably going to take about 40 minutes today. Probably won't take us the full hour, but it'll give us time to have some discussions at the end if needed. So first of all, we're going to talk about what difficulties specifically with maths that EAL learners face. Lots of the things I talk about today will be things that are good for all learners, and lots of the things I talk about today will also be good for EAL learners across the curriculum, but I'm going to try to be specific to maths where I can. We're going to talk about what we can do to support those learners in the language of maths, and there's a little bit more about maths as a language coming up. I'm also going to talk about one of my specialisms is mastery approach. Now, if you're teaching in primary or working in primary, you will probably have quite a good understanding of the mastery approach. I know that it's going out to more and more secondary schools as well. So we'll talk a little bit about how key things with a mastery approach to teaching that will help EAL learners as well as all learners, and then we'll look at what resources we can use to help. I have got a few little question marks dotted throughout the session. As it's a recorded session, I won't have big long silences, but I might have a couple of times where I just pause, and you can have a little think and maybe drop a couple of ideas in the chat if you have them. Just for your reference, really, there are a couple of main things I used for referencing for today, and I've just dropped the links in there, as well as drawing on experience and the experience of other members of my team as well. So that is what we've got in store for the next 40 minutes or so. So first of all, then, a question for you, and if you feel happy to type your answer in the chat, you can. Otherwise, you can just think about it. Do you think that mathematics is a language in its own right? Could you describe mathematics as a language, and why would you say it is, or why would you maybe say it isn't? Have a little think, and if you can pop some ideas into the chat. Just while you're having a little think about that, I'm going to share with you the definition of a language as shared by the Collins English Dictionary. So they say that a language is a system of communication which consists of a set of sounds and written symbols which are used by the people of a particular country or region for talking or writing. So my thought then is that in the first half of that definition, we could say that maths is a language, couldn't we? It is a system of communication, and it uses a set of maybe sounds and definitely written symbols. Whether or not they're used by people of a particular country or region, we'll talk a little bit more about in a minute. So if you think, yeah, absolutely, I agree. It's definitely a code, isn't it? And it's definitely a way of communicating. So thank you for those inputs. Now, that in mind, then, another question for you. Would we say that the language of mathematics is universal? I think a lot of people and educators, when they're talking about teaching EAL learners, particularly in a primary classroom, they quite often say that actually maths is one of the easier subjects because, maths is a universal language. So just interesting to know your thoughts there on whether it is universal or not. And I've got a couple of examples to show you on the next slide. So just something to think about. Yes, it may be true that mathematics is a lot more accessible than other areas. However, it isn't quite universal. And I've got some examples to show you here. So this is my first one. Now, when I was teaching year 3, yeah, absolutely, Helen, I agree with you. It can be universal, but there are some differences, and that's what I'm going to share now. So this is an example of some Arabic translations. And if you have a look at the numerals, you might notice some similarities between the numerals and the Arabic numerals underneath them. I was teaching somebody, a year 3 boy, who really struggled with things like numbers more than, less than. So he was really struggling saying, what was 1 more than 26, and so on. And we really were a bit confused, and we'd done all the normal things about supporting and so on. And it was only when he came to show and tell and brought us his book, his exercise books from his Arabic school that he was going to on a Saturday, that we realized that actually the difficulty he might be having could be because some of the numerals written in English script look quite different to look quite the same to different numerals in Arabic script. So you can see there, you know, you could argue there's a similarity between the 5 and the 0 and a 6 and a 7. So you can see where differences in symbols can cause some difficulties for children who are coming to English as an additional language. Another common one is this one, the use of the decimal point. Now, lots of European countries don't use a decimal point. I don't use a full stop for a decimal point. They use a comma. I think if you were learning in the English national curriculum, if you looked at that left-hand side box, you would very much think that was maybe a coordinate reference. We don't tend to write numbers with a comma in like that, or maybe the start of a list. But actually, in some curriculums, that is how decimal points are written. So again, you could think something as small and straightforward as a decimal point, but actually your learners may be coming with a completely different experience of that symbol, which is why, you know, a lot of the things I'm talking about today are quite generic, but it's really important that you've got an understanding of where your learners have come from, particularly if they are much older learners. Really getting to know the systems that they're familiar with can be really useful. Another one is dot multiplication. In some places, they use a dot instead of a multiplication symbol. That's just an example there. Of course, then that can cause a little bit of confusion because 4.5 looks very similar to 4.5, which can cause difficulties as well further down. And yeah, someone's just pointed out, yeah, the calculations, the way that the actual calculations are done, the sort of the procedural understanding can be quite different. We were very lucky to have some Ukrainian children in one of the team's classes who did us some videos of them talking through and walking us through their methods of calculation. And it was really interesting to compare. And that's a really good discussion to be able to have with your students. So it's important to have those discussions. And then finally, and this is one that comes up often, because even in the national curriculum, sometimes you will see larger numbers written with a space to separate the place value columns, and sometimes you'll see them with a comma. And again, in some countries they would put so I think France particularly, they will put a dot to separate the place value columns. So at first glance you might think, yes, maths is a universal language, everybody can talk maths. That would be true if we were all using the same symbols and the same methods. It's not quite that straightforward, although you could argue that some areas of maths are easier to access due to the lack of words, and we'll come on to that in a little bit. Okay, so why can maths in particular be such a challenge for EAL learners? Well, there are a few different things that come up in maths that make it tricky, and one of them is the use of technical math specific words. With a teaching for mastery approach, and really teachers now really looking at making sure that children's understanding is there, it's really important that the correct words are used for things. If we don't use the correct words, children won't become familiar with them and won't be confident in using them themselves. However, some of those words are quite tricky, and I've just put a few there that you can see. They come from different languages. They're very difficult to decode. I mean, isosceles, the spelling patterns don't necessarily follow normal English spelling patterns for the English language, and they can be quite tricky to pronounce, read and spell. So before we've even started doing any maths, the language that we're using, particularly if it's written down, can be quite tricky. So the ways that we can support with that are making sure that we're using visuals, and I will keep referencing visuals all the way through today's session. Anytime where you're using language which is complex or ambiguous, using a visual alongside can be really, really powerful. And here's just a few examples of the sorts of things you might have. And these are Twinkl examples, but there's a wealth out there of things you can find. Word mats, which aren't necessarily to do with translation, but have got really good visuals of what each image might represent. You've got there's a particular instructions one there using images to support that, and in some cases it might be worth having two language mats that show it in both languages, so that EAL learners aren't using a lot of their cognitive load working out the language, but they're able to focus on the maths. One thing which is worth mentioning is there are so many things out there that you can get to support children visually in maths, and it's so important. However, it's just as good for children to create their own, almost like a maths glossary, and actually a little bit more powerful if you can get children, if you've got time and you've got additional adults that can support with it, to create their own almost glossary of terms in their own, you know, they've done their own images, or they cut things out, or they make it on the computer. And equally just as useful can be in a lesson if you realize that there is a lack of understanding, drawing out an image on a post-it note. They don't have to look shiny and colourful and laminated, but having a real clear link between those images and the words and the concepts is really, really important. So we've got some complex vocabulary. We've also got vocabulary which is used in everyday life as well as maths, but the meaning might be slightly different. So I'm going to share some with you now, but you might be thinking of some already that you know, that are words that have a different meaning when they're used in maths. The biggest one, and it caused lots of discussions in classes, is the word difference. I think with younger children particularly, if you're asking what is the difference between 2 and 7, for example, one of the first answers might be, well, 2's got a curve in it, and 7 is just made up of straight lines. Absolutely right. That is a difference. It's not a mathematical difference. So it's a challenge, isn't it, to know, first of all, the everyday use of a word, but also the mathematical use. So again, we can support that with the use of images. So this is an example of how you might use a bar model to show what the difference is. And you could put a calculation there. Obviously, we could find the difference by doing 12 subtract 5 there. But just a visual to show what is meant by these words that people may be familiar with, learners may be familiar with them, but in a different context. I've got a couple more. Volume is another one. Children and learners may well know that volume is for how loud a sound is, and they might know about turning up the volume on a TV or a computer or a phone, but they might not know that the mathematical meaning of volume is the amount of space inside a container. So you're already hitting a barrier before you've even thought about the maths there. Odd can be used in lots of different ways in language. We specifically in maths use it for a number, which can, when divided by 2, doesn't give you a whole number answer. But that's quite complicated. So it's about finding images and ways of describing these things to your learners so that they can make the difference between everyday language and maths language. Change is another one, and a really, really familiar one. It could be change is a word that EAL learners may well know quite well from everyday language. We use the word change a lot. Do they know, though, that change means the money you get back when you spend? And it's when you start thinking about why we use these words, it's quite an interesting discussion to have, particularly with older classes, as to where these where these words come from and why we use them. But definitely worth considering when you are teaching particularly written problems. Just a little question for you guys there. You don't have to answer in the chat, you can just have a little think, but there might be some other mathematical vocabulary that you can think of that has alternative meanings. And I think that's the really, just to be careful, is that it's not just about understanding the language, but it's about making sure that people know that it's got a different meaning in everyday language. It's interesting that the word divided has come up in the chat. Absolutely, we're going to talk about divided in a bit more detail actually on one of the next slides, so I won't talk about that one yet. Brings us nicely on to multiple words with the same meaning. So yeah, we've got all this technical language which comes from different sources and can be quite difficult to decode and read. Then we've got words that actually have a different meaning in everyday use, and then we have the fact that we have a lot of words that mean the same thing, and it can be really tricky. If you're learning a new language, it can be hard enough to learn one word. If you've got 4 or 5, as we're going to talk about now, it can be really key, because actually this, for example, there are 5 words there which are synonymous with number. They all mean technically the same thing. They're talking about a number or a digit. All of these words would come up in year 6 SATs and obviously beyond that. So it's not that these are words that I've just used a thesaurus to get. These are words which year 6 children are expected to know mean the same. So that's quite tricky, isn't it? If you have to learn one of the words, you have to learn them all. And divided, funnily enough, is the one that I've put here. How many words can you think of that we could use that are synonymous with divide? What could we use instead of divide? How many are there? Maybe drop some ideas in if you've got some. And I think it's quite shocking how many we have that mean the same thing. Share, split, equal groups, perfect. And these are all things, aren't they, that when we're teaching maths and teaching decoding of word problems, we talk about looking for these clues. You know, look for the clues that will help us to work out what we need to do. Well, if you don't understand the meaning of those clues, that can be really, really tricky. So again, it is worthwhile trying to find ways to share these word banks. What we don't want to do is only use one word, because that won't help to improve the familiarity with it. At first you might, but it's really important to start dripping in different versions of these words so that the children have a really good understanding that they all mean the same thing and can be used in very similar ways. Or if they have, if they're similar but not quite the same, eventually you'll need to talk about what those differences are. So, I mean, again, there's a lot out there. Here are some Twinkl examples of word mats. Bookmarks, that's another quite nice one. Things that can be stuck in the back of books that can flap so that you can pull them out and refer to them. Word mats, translations as well, so you can see them side by side. But already, I mean, we've only talked about words so far, and you can see actually, although maths isn't maybe as tricky as the English language, there are lots of things here that are going to really create barriers. And the way around that is to ensure that we are ready for it. We understand where our learners are coming from and what their experiences are when they come to learning with us, and making sure that we provide visual representations wherever possible. And this will benefit all learners as well. Visual representation in maths is a really important thing. So this is just us talking about words, but what about when we're looking at a lot of words? Word problems are notorious in maths for lots of year 6 pupils. This week will be groaning at the amount that they're having to look at to work out what maths is required in a worded problem. It's really hard to navigate around, but it's important. It's important to make maths meaningful. It's important that children know why they're doing the maths and give it a real life context. And it's important to be able to apply their knowledge. So we do need to do it. Again, we can't avoid doing it. There are, though, some additional barriers for EAL learners when tackling word problems. It's about understanding all the language, not just understanding symbols and maths words. The structure of the problems themselves can cause a problem. They often use connectives and pronouns, and they're also written in present tense. So the structure can be quite unfamiliar to learners. The narrative structure, sometimes if we have a problem which is Bob was going to the shop and he was going to buy some eggs and he had this much money and he spent that, and if he bought this many eggs, how much did he have left? The narrative structure implies that we're going to deal with the things in order, and that isn't always how word problems should be tackled. So it's really important that we think about the structure of those problems. Also, you know, the length of the word problems can cause anxiety in lots of learners. You know, if you look at a page of writing, you know, maths test, and you turn over and there's a page of writing, it can produce a lot of anxiety for anybody, really, because there's a lot to look at. You have to work out what you need to do, and it's probably going to take a little bit of time. And we don't want to build that anxiety in maths. We really want for children to embrace things as positively as they can, with that growth mindset. So having a big chunky word problem and providing it to a learner that doesn't necessarily have a really secure understanding of the English used in there is going to cause some anxiety. So lots of issues there. So what can we do? Oh yeah, and also quite often you will find a word problem on a page by itself, which without any visual scaffold at all. So there are things that we can do to try to support it. This is one of our lovely EAL team resources on site, and it just shows the understanding needed to access quite a straightforward word problem. So the word problem is that Mo and George have 2 jam donuts, 4 custard donuts, 2 cream donuts all together. They share them equally between themselves. How many donuts do they get each? There's not loads and loads and loads of words, but you can see from the color coding, there are lots of difficulties. First of all, the names. Are they familiar names? We need to maybe teach children how you spot names, place names and people's names in problems, and explain that actually it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter what those people's names are. It's not relevant to the maths. But you don't want children to have to spend a long time decoding, working out some names before they even get to the maths. The word donuts is an interesting one, not the easiest to decode. And is donuts a familiar concept? Maybe not. Jam, custard, cream, I mean, very familiar to me, but are they familiar to everybody? Will EAL learners be familiar with those words and what they mean? And will they know that it doesn't necessarily matter if they don't know what those means for the context of the question? Do the children know what altogether means? That's one of those clue words, isn't it? It gives us an idea of what we might need to do to solve the problem. If you don't understand altogether, that's going to be tricky. If you don't know that means you need to add them all up, you're going to find it difficult to solve the problem. Does share them equally cause a problem? If we don't know what the word equal, the understanding behind equal is, we might have difficulty accessing the problem. And between themselves, I mean, the use of pronouns and things like that can be very tricky, and the structure doesn't necessarily follow the structure of other languages. So there's an awful lot there for quite a straightforward problem. There's an awful lot there. So what can we do to support? Because what you really don't want to get into the habit of doing is giving EAL learners different problems. You want them to be able to access the same maths as their peers. You want to be able them to access maths at their age-related expectations. So it's about thinking ahead and how we can make it more accessible. And I appreciate that teachers' time particularly and TA time is so precious, but just being one step ahead and trying to adapt resources will really help your learners. And this is the example. So we've got visuals. They're not maths visuals, but they're visuals. They explain what's meant by the jam donuts, the custard donuts, and the cream donuts. They've also got some symbols in there. They've got a plus sign after all together, and they've got a division symbol after talking about sharing equally. And there's a structure there to support their understanding in the form of the 2 circles. And finally, for the very final bit of the question, there's an equal sign. So I mean, that in itself is quite a lot to take on. And again, being able to break that down and look at the structure with your learners will really help. But putting those images in will certainly free up a little bit of cognition so they can really focus on that maths. And that's the tricky thing. It's really making sure that they've got time to show what they can do mathematically rather than spending a lot of time trying to translate. Okay, word problems can you can often solve a word problem without understanding all of the words. So whilst you cannot possibly teach learners every possible structure they might come across, there are some very familiar structures that come up often in things like the statutory tests, on NCTM resources, for example, White Rose resources, lots of things that come up time and time again. So it is worth using those structures, talking through those structures, modeling the structures, and making sure that children have lots of experience of them. Now, I've got a problem here in French. Now, if you are a fluent French speaker, you will not find this too difficult. If you, like me, have got a little tiny bit of French tucked away somewhere from GCSEs a very long time ago, you might be able to work out some of them. But I've tried to choose a problem. I want us to sit in the shoes, really, of our learners. So I'm not even going to attempt to read it out to you, but I'm just going to give you a second to have a read through of that problem. And no matter what your French is, have a think about, what do you know, what can you work out from that problem, and what do you need to know to be able to solve it. Yeah, the numbers jump out, don't they? And I think that's the thing that children often do, and this is true of all children, all learners. They often will go straight to the numbers. And the difficulty there, of course, is that we've got a 2.5 kilograms with a comma, because it's French and that's what they do. So that might prove a difficulty, but we've got a 2.5 in there and we've got a 14 in there. Knowing what to do with them might be a little bit harder. So even if you knew, and I think I remembered that pomme de terre was potatoes, there's something about potatoes in here, maybe in 2.5 kilograms. So I might be able to get that far. And this one, 14 potatoes in the bag, I think we might be able to navigate our way through that, maybe. I mean, it's taken a lot of brain power to get to that point, and I haven't done any maths yet. I've just accessed the question. The next bit, though, I can see kilogram in there, and I can see potato in there, and I can see the word mass. So that might be helpful, although actually we already had the kilogram, so maybe the mass was already there. The point is, actually, even if the numbers are really easily recognizable, you do need to know a little bit more, and you might be able to work some out, but you might need a little bit of help. I mean, I'll read it to you in a minute in English, unless we might have some fluent French speakers in here. I have got a translation written down because I wasn't going to try and do it off the top of my head, but you can see, I mean, actually, it's quite, for me, it was quite stressful. It's like, well, I don't know what that word means, and I might not have any way of working it out. And I think that's the important thing. If you're using questions like this with your learners, you don't want to have that anxiety. So if you want them to be familiar with such problems, you need to give them a way to work it out, whether it's a dictionary, a maths dictionary, a peer, a place to go to check. Obviously, there's lots of translation devices. It could be one of those. But if you can't find the answer, it can be quite stressful. So this is the question in English. It's a grocer sells potatoes in bags of 2.5 kilograms. So you might have been on the right track with that. One bag contains 4 potatoes. And then the next bit says, what is the average mass of one potato to the nearest thousandth of a kilogram? I don't think, unless you have quite a good understanding of the language, the French there, that you would have been able to work out that that's what it meant. You would maybe be able to have a good guess, but that's not what we want children to do. We want children to apply the maths to show that they have got a really good understanding. So that was just putting us in the shoes, really, of the learners. Really think about what would have helped. Well, pictures might have helped. It might have been, I mean, the first word, the grocer, I didn't know what that meant, and it could have been something really, really important. Having a picture of a grocer there might have put my mind at rest. So I didn't have to worry about that because it wasn't relevant to the maths, and so on. So it's those visuals, those methods of working out what things mean are really, really important. Teaching for Mastery is all about children having a really good understanding of maths. It's not about moving on too quickly, but about keeping up with their age-related expectations and making sure they've got a really secure understanding before moving on. So this is a really good concept for all learners, but also for EAL learners. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the main features of Teaching for Mastery and how they can support EAL learners in your setting. We talked a little bit earlier about precise mathematical language. You, as educators, need to model that. Don't shy away from it. Increase familiarity where you can. But also, it's really important for peers to do it as well. You know, working collaboratively is a real key point in mastery, and children will use the language that they need to use a lot more. And so if they're working with somebody else, that could be really helpful. STEM sentences are really familiar in maths these days, and they're about scaffolding maths talk. So I've got an example there for you. It's a sentence stem, which is normally filled in the first time for you, so you can see. So from that picture at the top, we've got there are more pears than apples. There are fewer apples than pears. So this is about the words more and fewer and the understanding of those. And then you start taking away some of those words and asking the children to fill those words in. The idea being that they've got a scaffold then for their language, whether it's spoken or written, but they've got that structure and they can use it. They're not looking around in their mind for the structure of the sentence. It's there for them. So STEM sentences are really, really advantageous for EAL learners because the structure is there, and lots of maths resources now will have STEM sentences built in. That's just one example. The CPA approach is about starting with the concrete, moving on to the pictorial representations, and then finally to the abstract. And it's about really building that understanding through use of manipulatives, be it cubes, physical number lines, bits of fractions, moving then to a pictorial representation. So children might draw it or have a representation of it, and then move into the abstract. And that's just an example there. If you were doing number bonds, you might use counters on a tens frame. You then might draw those counters on the tens frame, and eventually you might go to the abstract calculation that I've given an example of there. One of the things that it is really important to bear in mind with this is that we don't just go from concrete to pictorial to abstract. It's really important for children, particularly EAL learners, to scaffold the understanding, to have them alongside each other. So start with the concrete, introduce the pictorial alongside, and keep that there for a while, and then we might lose the concrete materials. Then we introduce the abstract alongside the pictorial, and then eventually you can remove the scaffold altogether when the children are completely ready and you've got a good understanding of the abstract concept there. So another really good thing that's happening in maths generally, which will be helpful for EAL learners particularly, because it will help support their understanding. We briefly mentioned working collaboratively, really important in mastery learning. Maths classrooms shouldn't be silent, heads down working. They should be hives of maths discussion and talk and working together to solve problems and spot patterns. So this in itself could cause a bit of a barrier, particularly if you've got children who are very new to the language. To be able to talk a lot about it can be tricky. But talking with peers does reduce the stakes for children. You know, the amount of anxiety does go down if children are doing it just in their pairs, not sharing it with anybody. Nobody's getting them to stand up and say it to the class. We're just chatting in amongst ourselves. And teachers often in mastery lessons now are helicoptering around the room and listening and talking and chipping in, and it's not about putting anybody on display. And there are lots of different activities that teachers deploy now for collaboration. How you group those children though is really, really important. If you are lucky enough to have a group or multiple children with the same first language, it can be really useful to allow them to discuss the maths in that first language, because it's the discussion around it and the spotting of patterns that's really important in understanding the maths. If you've got somebody who is the only person in your class with that particular language, their first language, maybe think about putting them with somebody who's going to be a really good role model, not just of language, but also of patience and collaboration, because it's scary, isn't it, to have a conversation with somebody in a language you're not familiar or confident in can be quite tricky. So I mean, finding perfect pairs for maths is a challenge for all educators and all children, but particularly if you've got EAL learners, really think about who you're going to pair them up with. Are you going to put them in 2s or 3s? How are you going to get them to work together to help everybody? And of course, for children who are being those good role models, that's a really good lesson for them as well, because if you can explain something to somebody, and if you can explain something to somebody who doesn't have a secure grasp of language, your understanding is really, really good. And that is a way to support a greater depth learner, is if they can support an EAL learner in some discussion. That's a really good way to test their level of understanding as well. So yeah, collaborative working relationships, obviously really good one for all ages, but also all areas of the curriculum too. To finish off then, this is the trickiest thing, I think, when we come to talking about EAL and maths, is assessment. How can you possibly get a really true assessment of learners and their understanding of maths when there is so much language involved? I mean, we've talked about so many things this evening that will provide barriers for children, particularly if they are sitting a statutory test where they might not necessarily get to have visuals or glossaries or word mats, whatever you're using. How can we make sure we do it? Well, it's a bit of a minefield, but there is a fabulous piece of research. I've put the link on the slides for you there, and it's by Cambridge Maths, so it's a really good source. And their conclusion, and I kind of summed up everything that I found on the subject and everything from my own experience, is that we should try to avoid assessments that aim only to test students' knowledge of mathematics, which include culture-specific language and complex details. We don't want to have those in a test that is testing mathematical ability. If they're not relevant to the maths, it's not going to give us a true understanding and assessment. Now, as we've talked about, we don't want to avoid using all that language because familiarity will help with confidence. But if you are creating, and statutory tests are another thing, but when you're doing end of unit assessments or retrieval practice, anything like that, really aim not to include culture specific language. And it's sometimes hard to recognize it. If it's your first language, you might not realize how complex it is until you really take it apart. But we should try to avoid that. And also including lots of complex details that aren't relevant. There might be a place for it for some of your learners, but if you're really wanting to find out what the maths ability is, we should try to avoid overcomplicating it, particularly if we've got informal, summative or formative assessment that we're doing in class. And if your children are used to using word banks and so on, it could be that you will start doing that at the beginning and then gradually start removing those scaffolds as they're ready. But yeah, assessment is really, really tricky because you want to know what maths they do, but you also know how important it was at the end of year 6. You know, the SATs paper has got a lot of reading involved as well. It's worth mentioning that things can be read out loud, which can be really helpful for EAL learners. We can't read certain numbers, or depending on the question, the fractions and things, but the actual language can be read aloud, and sometimes that can be really helpful because at least it takes out the decoding.